Yeah, and speaking of, how long can you run from art innate violence? George Washington by David Gordon Green, notable director of such art house classics as Pineapple Express.
And the upcoming Halloween movie, which I'm very excited for.
I'm definitely excited for that. This is a very different film for David Gordon Green if you're familiar with the rest of his work.
Yeah.
It premiered in February of 2000 at the Berlin Film Fest. And then in North America, it premiered at TIFF the same year, where it won the Discovery Award. And it also made a big splash at Newport with a Best Actor award awarded to the entire ensemble, a Best Director award, and Best Dramatic Film. So it was a big film on the festival circuit when it came out. And it came out right during this renaissance of new American independent cinema.
Yeah, it definitely learns a lot from. I mean, certainly on one hand, it's a little bit of a love letter to Malick.
Oh, totally.
It also learns a lot, I think, from new American cinema and American independent cinema, and kind of the grittiness and the DIY attitude of making these films and just letting actors and environments speak for themselves.
It's really interesting, some of the choices as far as like framing of shots and zooms. Even though they shot, on legitimate cinema cameras, it's very reminiscent of what was happening on video cameras from the Dogma 95 movement in the mid 90s with directors like Lars von Trier. So you definitely have that influence from, these new American cinema directors who are really rewriting the rules of cinema in a way that hadn't really happened since the French New Wave.
So Dogma 95 is like an experimental filmmaking movement that Danish directors Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg developed. It's kind of a manifesto slash collective of filmmaking ideals.
It's an experiment. It's very strict rules that were very inventive for the time, mostly because of the immediate prevalence of quality personal video recorders.
Right. I mean, von Trier himself really only made a couple of films that actually adhered to the standards. It's more of a goal of trying to make films as naturalistic as possible. So it's ideas like shooting has to be done on location rather than on a set. Camera has to be handheld. The director can't be credited. These ideas of making the film sort of refusing to adhere to any ideals of special effects, post-production, or other gimmicks that would reduce the film's quote-unquote purity. On the other hand, then you have American independent cinema, which is relatively modern, so like mid-90s movies that were becoming more provocative.
The same time.
Right. Becoming more provocative in their topics and their styles. You have Sex, Lies, and Videotape by Steven Soderbergh, Clerks by Kevin Smith, Pulp Fiction from Tarantino, Boys Don't Cry by Kimberly Pierce. These were films that were dealing with sex, queer identity, American working class, and violence in kind of unique and provocative ways. And from a mix of those ideals come George Washington, which comes a little bit after the movement. It was released in 2000. But definitely you can tell that David Gordon Green had a lot of learning experience from that era of films.
Yeah, so that's, it was a very interesting time for American independent cinema. This is about a decade after the real rise of Sundance as the premier film festival in America. You're seeing this first Sundance generation of filmmakers really start to make their Hollywood films this time. You have, this is a couple years after Quentin Tarantino made Jackie Brown and really broke out there. This Sundance generation had become established filmmakers at this point.
Right. And so you had the people that grew up on the Sundance generation, or might have even been, still independent Sundance generation folks, trying to take those ideals and still make movies in that lens and keep it a very small, intimate, low budget affair and try to let the story come first.
Yeah, so this is, a really great film that often gets overlooked. It was never in wide release.
Mm-hmm.
But you can get it on Criterion, on Blu-ray and DVD. It's on iTunes and Amazon and Filmstruck in the USA. There is no distribution whatsoever for this in the UK.
It's a pretty small film from release standards. It's a little hard to find.
But I think it's an important film. I think you can trace a direct route from this to Moonlight.
Oh, for sure. I mean, Barry Jenkins said that he really likes this film and he likes its portrayal of black youth and interracial relationships in the South, in impoverished areas.
It doesn't sugarcoat it, but it also doesn't dramatize it.
It has a very, I think one of my favorite things about it is this mix of nostalgia and pain from childhood, and kind of illustrating that the warm glow of a summer and then the reality that can happen in that summer. Mm-hmm. And kind of the simultaneous trick that kids play of innocence and also sometimes knowing a little bit more than they let on.
Yeah. And this was not a critical darling.
For the few that saw it, it was decently well received. And I know a lot of people whom I respect really like it. It's much like being a film that was made by a film lover. It seems like other film lovers tend to like this film.
Yeah, and it had an 84% on Rotten Tomatoes and an 80% on Metacritic, so it did well with the critics, but it did not have like the universal acclaim like we saw from the Florida Project or Moonlight recently,
or even The Writer. I mean, I think a big part of it is its narrative is a little. I mean, one of my biggest complaints with it is the narrative.
It's a little weak at times.
Yeah, the narrative is not. I wouldn't even say inaccessible. Sometimes it's like not really there. Elements of the narrative will sometimes kind of come in and out of focus, and I think it's not always to the service of the movie's themes or emotions.
It feels just a little stunted on the edges, but it's a really valuable film to check out.
Yeah, a little underbaked. I mean, like I said, because the plot is so free-flowing, it can be a little difficult to summarize, but basically it's about a bunch of kids that are growing up in a small town, relatively poor in North Carolina.
Predominantly black.
Yeah, predominantly black. Most of the work, it seems like, comes from railroad work that the adults will work on. And a lot of the kids don't have a lot of structure or opportunities in their lives. I mean, they literally play on the railroad or in like empty pools or in rundown parks. It's very much... I mean, it very much has that feeling of kids just wandering out.
It's a lot like Ratcatcher.
Yeah, just kids just wandering out into their environment and the realities that can accompany having an environment that's not actually suited for kids.
Yeah, and I think this film, more than even Badlands or The Rider, really faces the question of the precipice between childhood and adulthood, which is a theme that we talked about last week with Ratcatcher. I think this really drives it home that there are some kids who just sit on that edge of handling adult situations and then not. Right.
And I mean, this is, a big part of it is Kyle wants to get in his requisite 2 to 3 coming of age films every week. But
didn't you choose this one?
I did choose this one. But, I like to think it was influenced by your...
I have a type.
Yeah, it's like I said, it balances so well that tenderness of youth with being able to handle the harsh realities and also being ill-equipped for it. I mean, the film opens up with, I love the opening scene where it's Buddy is a young, bespectacled black kid, and he's breaking up with Nausea, who is, I think, a year older than he is. They're like 11 and 12. And the way they're going about this conversation is...
She makes a big deal about either the fact that she is 13 or almost 13, as if that means she needs a real man. There's that whole exchange.
No, yeah, she's 12. A big theme for Nausea. And she is also the narrator, so we'll get into that and how it relates to Badlands. But big thing for her is that Buddy is not as mature as she wants him to be. And part of that is that Buddy's 11 years old, but Buddy is also the kind of kid that will put on a T-Rex mask and recite either Shakespeare or Bible verses in an empty, overgrown theater.
Yeah,
he very much has this combined over seriousness and a little bit of like the goofy 11-year-old. What happens is these kids are forced to confront reality and their inability to like be mature enough for that reality. And so to that point, maturity is a big theme of the film, whether it's breaking up with your 12-year-old girlfriend or being dumped by your 12-year-old girlfriend, or dealing with having a broken family, a mother who passed and a father who's in jail. So you're raised by your aunt and uncle.
And I think one of these big themes here is, taking adult responsibility in adult situations. And the crucial fact is, at the key moment, the kids don't. They fail. They run and hide from a situation. And that just causes more pain for a lot of people around them.
So pretty similarly to The Rider and Badlands, although it's a very different environmental location, this being set in a small kind of rural North Carolina town, rather than Midwest expanse. But these kids are very much trapped and defined by their environment. The reality that they play on railroads and in rundown parks and in bathrooms and stuff like that. Like that's just the area that they have, and they're sort of trapped to and defined by that limitation.
And there's also no real parental figure whatsoever. I mean, at home there is, but
Right.
they're running around trying to steal cars and stuff for fun because there's no influence there. They're just running wild.
Oftentimes it's a single parent household, and then those parent or parents then have a job they got to take care of, and 4 or 5 kids are just going to do what kids do, which is go off and find something more entertaining.
And they don't really have like a playground. They really make do with, they have this, just like you said, huge areas of decay that have just been reclaimed by the earth. And they make games out of it.
And I think that tension is really beautifully illustrated. How the effects of sort of a post-industrialist town where railroads are, even then in 2000, but certainly now, railroads are not what they used to be in American economics and in American occupational lifestyles. And so you have sort of the struggle of American capitalism and the inevitable sort of toll that nature takes on it.
Yeah.
The earth is literally reclaiming space, and the kids are sort of playing on this middle ground of what was once civilized, I suppose I would say, versus the reality of just kind of wild land taking it back over. So, I mean, a big part of the tension comes from the kids failing to talk to the adults about what has happened and properly deal with it. And so instead they have to kind of bear with this guilt and anxiety themselves, and it emotionally is tearing them apart. Each of them shows different displays of like a post-traumatic anxiety. Eventually the adults do get involved and catch wind of it, but I think it's at best at that point it's kind of just so that the kids realize that, so they can escape the guilt that they're feeling. But I mean, a big part of it also is George, the titular character, whose last name isn't actually Washington. That's kind of...
The term George Washington is a nickname, basically, because of his obsession with heroes.
Right. And this event and this film is sort of a turning point for him in the reality of what does it mean to become a hero, and what is the pain and maturity that has to be involved in that.
And ultimately, like, he fails when he needs to.
He does.
And he goes and he redeems himself, and he is still focused on, these good deeds and being a hero in his community. But when it mattered for his friends, he failed.
But I think the film doesn't actually judge him too much for that, which
No, because he's a kid.
Right, exactly. It's because he is on that cusp, and that's sort of the inherent and necessary pain of that maturation, is the fact that for many kids, that is the point of maturity, is when you are faced with these horrible situations and how quickly you're able to acclimate to them, and the reality that you're not going to instantly adapt to it.
And horror is a really interesting word, because I think this film dealt with real themes of horror.
Oh yeah, there's
a moment in this film that is breathtaking in how dark it is.
Yeah, it has its moments of extreme gut-wrenching sadness.
And I think a big part of that is the fact that the moment of horror is this, very violent thing that is portrayed with absolute realism.
Mm-hmm.
It happens. It's done. Nothing you can do now.
Right. I mean,
it plays out in real time without any exaggeration. And I think that's something that makes it very distinct. It has an impact.
It refuses to sugarcoat how these things happen.
The finite nature of life.
Right. It illustrates in particular the reality that as heroes, we don't have superhuman powers. At best, you're a kid wearing a singlet and a helmet, and you're just trying to do the best you can with that.
It's a very interesting film. I didn't love it, honestly, but it does a lot of interesting things. And, like you were talking about, the voiceovers are very clearly inspired by Malick.
Right. Yeah. And I think they're used to a strong effect, like we were saying, because the voiceover in Badlands represents Holly's sort of unreliability. I think likewise you have the voiceover ironically represents Nasia's immaturity and her blindness to some of the ugliness that is in her town. And at the same time, I think again doesn't necessarily condemn it, because it is also,
She's a kid.
you have to appreciate the fact that she does still see beauty.
Also, it does a really interesting thing where it hides the fact that she is unaware of events going on.
Yeah, that also is, I mean, I wouldn't say she's a minor character, but as far as the ensemble goes, she's not a major focus.
I still am kind of hung up on, I don't know, they're a weird ensemble.
Much like the free-flowing nature of the narrative, characters are very naturalistically in and out.
Yeah, and that's also just like these friends feel very real because they're just kids who met each other playing. Like,
right.
They don't complement each other well. You have an age difference. You have, one is very clearly fairly athletic, and then you have this other kid, George, he was born with a misformed head, and he's incredibly sensitive. He can't be, in water. He can't risk any kind of damage to his head.
Misformed head is such a gnarly way to put it.
The membrane on his head was misformed. Is that better?
Right. I mean, it was that his skull didn't properly fuse after infancy.
Yes. Thank you.
I'm out here being a biomedical engineer, so we can really put proper terms to this.
And then you have this kid Sonya, who is one thing white, which stands out in this ensemble. She's also dramatically younger than them, and yet she rolls with the boys, and she's totally able to keep up with them in their roughhousing and their everyday life and their hooliganism until events kind of hit the fan and she has to handle things and process things very differently.
I mean, eventually I would say that. I don't even necessarily think that... I think her role as one of the people that eventually...
I don't think she's even the most immature character.
Yeah, no, I think... I'm trying to think what I think of Sonya. I think it's interesting that her gender isn't significant. I mean, we see frequently Nasia interacts mostly with her older sister and her group of friends, or her older sister's group of friends.
And most of their conversation, doesn't pass the Bechdel test. They're talking about boys, they're talking about pregnancy, they're talking about...
That kind of, that kind of teenage girl thing.
And then you have Sonya, who's probably 10. She's either very tiny or she's very young.
No, I would say about 10.
And, I don't think they ever even really explicitly mention her gender.
Right, which I think it's interesting. I mean, very much like the natural constraints of the kids' environments, they're naturally constrained to who their friends are. You avoid a lot of interracial and intergender tension when you're young enough that those aren't even really things that you have to consider. I might only be friends with other boys, but there's not that many. So you just kind of make friends where you get them. And
I think this film also goes out of its way not to call attention to her gender.
Right.
One of the pivotal scenes takes place in a men's room.
Right.
And she's just there. And it's really interesting kind of how it handles that.
Yeah, I think part of the decay of the town comes with it the decay of those societal norms that are mainly prescribed by people who don't have anything better to do, so to speak.
Yep.
Nobody cares that there's a girl in the men's bathroom, because why would they? They got other things to worry about.
And the importance of religion is kind of pretty prominent here. There's a lot of these traditional Southern Baptist churches present, and that's very clearly present in their lives. And yet we do see that kind of breakdown.
Well, I think it's interesting because is it George's mother
When the pastor comes.
or aunt, yeah, who there's at least there's one, I think it's George's aunt, who doesn't like the pastor, because I think he illustrates to her sort of a false promise that, like, they they're aware of what their economic situation is, and they're aware that they're kind of trapped there as adults. I think it's not insignificant that one of the opening scenes is also Uncle George's Uncle Damascus, who's talking about basically the horrible toll that working on the railroad has taken on him, and the lack of benefits and lack of health care. Like, these are people very much at the end of their rope and very much forgotten. And I think sort of the inability of that religious structure to properly identify and address those needs has led to a bit of a religious languishing.
So this film's really interesting in how it kind of confronts poverty like that. And it's not a perfect film, but it's important when you're looking at, where the roadmap between something like Badlands in the 70s and something today like The Rider exists.
Yeah, I mean, it honestly, the biggest disappointment to me is the fact that when the narrative kind of loses some of its direction, you're tempted to forget some of the utterly beautiful compositions and scenes. There's so many scenes that are just like genuinely heartwarming, and like, for someone like me, you got to understand, like, I am not a heart-warmed person. So there are moments of like such genuine beauty in this movie that I wish other parts of it were a little stronger. But even as it is, I do truly appreciate its grasp on those.
This is a film where the storytelling has so many roots in naturalism, and it really, tells things in a very realistic way, in a very languid and slow and taking its time way as far as the narrative. But you also have this incredible, dedication to its craft and formalism where, like you said, everything's beautifully composed. Everything's very vivid. It's very, Malick-esque.
Yeah, and it has those. I mean, it doesn't. I don't think it adheres to. I don't know enough about film technique, but I don't believe it adheres to like the Dogma 95 principles. But
absolutely not.
Yeah, but it has a lot of those ideals in place where it's reduce a film as best you can to this watchable encapsulation of life, and let it speak for itself.
But then this adds back in these really, really gorgeously constructed images. I mean,
oh man,
the scene of the one boy doing Shakespeare in the amphitheater, and you just have this great composition. It's an interesting mix where something like Ratcatcher doesn't take the time to smell the roses that this does.
Right. Well, yeah, and again, I mean, with Malick, you have those, and with The Rider, you have scenes where nothing is even really happening. It's just focusing on the environment and allowing the environment to be its own actor in the story. I think it's
and not just the environment as a living, breathing character, but also just as a thing of beauty.
Yeah,
I think that's like one of the differentiating things between the films we're talking about this week and the films we talked about last week, is they take that time to smell the roses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and that's very much. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to say it's a product of Malick, but Malick definitely had a huge influence on popularizing that idea.
Yes. So we hope you enjoyed that. These are all really great films that you should check out.
I think they're all probably some of the most accessible versions of this kind of idea that we're talking about, of this expanse.
Badlands is definitely Malick's most accessible film.
Yeah.
And I'm someone who's pretty critical of his work in general, and I really appreciate Badlands.
I mean, David Gordon Green has certainly gone on to make more accessible films, but not with this kind of theme.
Yeah. And it's really interesting to see kind of the direction his career went.
Yeah, it's I mean, I guess it is kind of what you were saying. Eventually, like, a lot of these people go on to make studio films, which is where but at the same time, Pineapple Express is a little bit of a satirization of studio filmmaking.
And I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying they're fundamentally different.
Moving away from that highly naturalistic approach.
Yes.
I mean, Malick's first film being really the most studio directed one of his, is an inversion of that.
Yeah, and it's really interesting comparing that to one of his more recent films, where a lot of that structure is gone.
Yeah, like the documentary literally talking about the beginning of the universe.
Yeah.